Okay, Rich. Rich, thank you for coming and speaking for us today. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
1 second, I'm just trying to put the video on, sorry.
That's okay, I rushed too much.
Very good.
And you're all live, your video is coming nicely through. Rich Bale.
Thank you. Okay, I'm Richard, or Rich Bale. I'm a senior teaching fellow in education development. I've brought along my violin, not sure, it's not quite a banjo, it's a violin, but just to, that's my link into performance, I guess, and also I was walking at lunchtime, so I missed Helen's secret talk, and then just came back at the end when you're talking about banjo, so I thought I'd get my violin out. My link into performance is very much very amateur. I'm a learner violinist, not very good. I play in a very amateur orchestra and often suffer from nerves. So I can be halfway through a piece in an orchestra performance and my bow hand will start shaking, which is not good on the violin. You get very scratchy sounds. So that's kind of where I come from in terms of thinking about teaching through a kind of performance lens, is my own fears and anxieties in performance. I used to work with GTAs, or graduate teaching assistants. In my institution, these are exclusively doctoral researchers who are teaching. I know some places there can be different colleagues, but where I work they're PhD students who are teaching. I've now left that role, but I'm still kind of in touch with parts of that job. That's why I'm talking about this today. I'm going to talk a bit first about why or how I understand expertise, and Nick has kind of helped me out there by making this distinction quite clear, I think, in terms of improvisation. So I think we've got quite good in universities at teaching ourselves and teaching teachers how to gain routine expertise. So these are things like attending workshops in centres like educational development centres, that kind of thing, doing whole courses like PG Certs, master's courses and so on things like how to plan lessons, how to write learning outcomes, these kind of routine things that are part and parcel of being a teacher in higher education. But then I borrow the concept of adaptive expertise. So an adaptive expert is somebody who can, as the name suggests, can adapt their existing skills, knowledge, experiences to new situations to solve novel problems. And this, I think, is where that discussion before about winging it versus improvising, I think this explains that quite well. So if you're just making things up as you go along, then there's perhaps no real basis to underpin what you're doing. Whereas if you're adapting your expertise for new situations, you have a foundation there to build from. And this is where, I keep pressing arrows rather than the slide. This is where we come to the idea of improvisation. So as has already been said by Nick before, this doesn't mean making things up as you go along. There's a foundation to build from. I've put here, there's a new book by Roger Kneebone, who's really interesting guy. He's a surgeon by training, and he works with people from all walks of life, from tailors, such as the book cover shows here, magicians and so on, and looks at how expertise manifests themselves in these different facets of life. And he says, improvising is what experts do. It's what makes experts expert, and that's across the board. In every field activity, experts have to improvise. So that, for me, kind of demonstrates quite nicely why this, as a concept, is useful for well, actually for anyone in life, really, but for teachers in particular. I mentioned before then that I used to work with GTAs, graduate teaching assistants, and in our routine workshops, so things like introduction to learning and teaching, intro to assessment and feedback, these kind of routine workshops that we would do with them, we'd ask them about their anxieties or concerns about their teaching role, their graduate teaching assistant role. And these are the kinds of things they would say in those workshops. I've put them into these three categories, so preparation and rehearsal, communication and confidence and identity. And for me, these all have a kind of performance aspect to them. And some of them also have a clear link to improvisation. So the first one there, under preparation time, we'd often have PhD students saying, I want to do a really good job with my teaching, but I have my PhD to do, my research to do, and find it really hard to prepare everything well enough and spend too much time on that. So they almost do too much preparation for their teaching. Second one down is a really good example, I think, as well, that you may have met in your own, with your own teaching or with your own students, is not knowing all the answers to students' questions, which can be a fear that particularly novice teachers would have, I think. But the point, of course, is that you haven't got to have all the answers. And looking at this from an improv perspective, the learning and teaching space then becomes a collaborative space where you, the teacher or teachers, and the students kind of create and curate knowledge together. From that, I developed a workshop, which we called Performative Aspects of Teaching, and then wrote up some of these ideas in a book. And the workshop kind of covers these points listed here. So it looks at teaching through a kind of performance lens. And it's quite important to mention here, we don't mean performing as an actor or being kind of inauthentic. It's about being yourself or a version of yourself. So I would often talk to GTAs about having a persona, a teaching persona. So the me down the pub with my friends, me at the orchestra, me presenting right now, they're different versions of the same me, but they're different personas. And that's quite an important point. So it's about being authentic, but a part of yourself. And the focus here then for the next few minutes is on this last point, improvisation. So I'll just say how we start this. I think I saw in the chat earlier, I think Jess mentioned it about this principle of yes and in improv. So Keith Johnston, renowned kind of theatre and improv, had his book Impro, long-standing book from 1970s. The whole idea then of improv, as applied to theatre, but also to other walks of life now as well, is about keeping things going, having a really open, collaborative environment. So if you're having a discussion with students and trying to get some ideas going in the classroom, there's a subtle but significant difference between saying to a student, yes, and, next idea, and yes, but. The yes, but can then close down ideas and close down that flow of idea generation. So that's the first thing. I asked them, the GTAs, to go around and have some idea generation using this yes and building principle, but also encourage them to take this forward into their own teaching so that when they're teaching their own students, they create this learning environment where their own students can feel they're in a place where they can collaborate in an open and positive way. One kind of concrete technique we look at in this workshop is the Meisner technique. So the actors and performers in the room will have heard of this, I'm sure. So Sanford Meisner was an American actor and acting trainer, and developed many activities and techniques for actors. And this one I think is useful because it's very simple and can be done by anyone, any pairs. Thanks, Petra. And it's really about getting out of your head, trusting yourself, trusting your instinct, and responding in the moment to what's happening in the room. And this is a repetition exercise. You have two people. Person A stands opposite person B, quite close, which you can't do right now in the current situation. And says, you have long hair. B repeats it in the first person, I have long hair. And at some point then, perhaps person A sees that person B starts smiling because maybe person B feels a bit ridiculous being watched and critiqued in this way. And it continues in this form. So get them doing this in the classroom for a few minutes. It's usually quite funny, ridiculous, and just teach them to be in the moment rather than just be thinking about the next activity or the next, or I don't know, I've got to tell the students about their homework next, or just making them think about right now. This is also really useful because in the teaching context, if you're thinking of teaching through a performance lens, you can, and I have been personally criticised as well for focusing on the teacher too much rather than the students, because you're thinking about the teacher's performance. But this actually shifts the focus from you, from the teacher in this case, onto the students. So there's quite a nice way of deflecting from the teacher as performer in that criticism. Just to wrap up, a few bits of feedback from the students. There's lots more to what we do, but I can't share all of that in this session today. But first thing was that I was really surprised pleasantly that the students were really open-minded to do some quite wacky things. It was my own prejudice thinking, working with mainly STEM PhD students, that they wouldn't want to lie down on yoga mats and do vocal exercises or the Meister technique I just showed you a second ago. But they're really open-minded to try different things. They said it helped them to identify links between teaching and performance, which was one of the key learning outcomes, so that was good, and helped them to find their own sense of being a teacher or a teaching persona. Some points for development. They wanted more, which is good, I guess. Some more workshops on specific points of performance. So this was just a 3-hour workshop. They want more on voice, body, improv, and so on, and more practical exercises. And interestingly, this happened before COVID. They wanted input on performance aspects of online teaching. So they seem to kind of fall along the road. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much. Any questions? I won't play the violin, don't worry.
Thank you, Rich. This is very interesting indeed. We had, as usual, quite an exciting chat. I'll try to pick up some of the themes from that for our questions, and colleagues are welcome to resurface any questions in the chat as we have a discussion. If I can start with where you finished, which is about the fact that this is a 3-hour workshop, but you offer more in addition to that. And I would just like to find out a bit more about how students experience the first 3 hours, and to what extent you have maybe some of the students who are not interested in more, and some who become very keen to experience this over and over again, and just some reflections on that, please.
Yeah, so I wasn't very clear. So we don't offer more yet.
Right.
So far it's a 3-hour standalone workshop, but the feedback is from them that they want more. They want more, kind of a series of workshops on different points of performance. I then left that job, so I don't do that role anymore. But I'm hoping my successor will take that forward. From the feedback, this sounds like I'm making up, but there's nobody who didn't seem to enjoy it. From the feedback responses we've had. We only ran it 3 times, so it's not a massive number. That's about 40 or so people across those three sessions, so it's not a massive number of people, but there was no one who said this isn't for me, or I don't see the link here between teaching and performance, which I expected. I expected some might say, well, I don't get this, I'm not a performer. But I spent a bit of time in the session saying that I'm not saying we're actors, but trying to make the links between teaching and performance. Maybe that's why they kind of bought into the idea a bit more.
Okay, thank you. You talked about the yes and normally in a theatre improv performance, the other party has your back. You know that they would always support you. And you also mentioned the word collaboration. I can see that working really well. We talked about peer teaching earlier, when you were with a colleague in a classroom and you have to both respond to what's happening and maybe throw out plan A and go into plan B. And that can be a supportive context. I wonder how the early career colleagues with whom you work feel about collaborating with students and feel like the students have their back, and how they can create that trusting relationship.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I'd almost turn it around and say that improv, if you have improv as a kind of underpinning philosophy for your teaching, then you set yourself up as, going back to the, I suppose many of us having learning and teaching strategies that are focusing on active learning and student-centered learning and so on. Actually, improv then can be a good vehicle to facilitate that. So you say that you say to your students, rather than saying I'm the teacher who knows everything, have all the answers, you set yourself up as a, you're their learning facilitator, and that means you haven't got to have all the answers, and that the students are there to work with you, rather than you telling them stuff constantly. And that's really what we tell, or used to tell the GTAs in all the workshops for the GTA program, but particularly in this one, in this performance one, was that you're not there to have all the answers. You're not there to be the guru of all knowledge, but you're there to work with students and to facilitate their learning. And that once you set that expectation from the beginning to your students, you're telling them almost explicitly that you expect them to work with you in that kind of collaborative way, which is the kind of, for me, that's the kind of underpinning idea of improv. It's you're working together.
Okay. And final question, there's a chat about whether when we teach, we perform, and we're being performers, and you talked about discovering your teaching persona. And earlier we talked about authenticity. And again, I would just like you to elaborate a bit more about the balance of these two ideas, please.
Yeah, so I think that's a good way of putting it, a balance, because this comes really from, so we have sessions on micro teaching, which I guess many of you have as well. And GTAs often say they've been told in the past, if they're nervous, either in teaching or perhaps it's for a conference presentation, the most frequent comment they're told is just be yourself. And I would always ask them, but what self? Which self are you talking about? Because we will have many selves. And as I said, if I'm teaching and my mum sits at the back of the classroom, or my best friend or whatever, they would find that quite strange, seeing me in that situation. So I'm still me, but it's a slightly different person or persona than if I'm out with my mum or watching TV or whatever at home with friends. So that's kind of how I see persona. It's a way of freeing yourself from this idea of being your one self, because that can be quite restrictive. I think you think, well, it have to be me. Then all of us are going to think, well, which me? Am I the me that I'm with my friends, or in this professional setting? And I just find that quite helpful personally, and that's kind of what I pass on to the GTAs when I discuss that with them. Not really answered the question very well, but
I think it did. I mean, I can definitely relate to sometimes you enter into your teaching persona and teaching goes smoothly, and sometimes you don't quite realign with that, and teaching is always a little bit off balance. So I can personally relate to what you just described. Thank you so much for your contribution. I would encourage colleagues to give us all a nice virtual, and thank Richard for his talk. Nice virtual sign of applause. And we thank you. And we are going to move swiftly